The turbulent decade of 1960, mutant superheroes, and a lone podcaster. Why is a child of the 80s making a podcast about the strangest Marvel superheroes of the 60s? Find out in episode 0 of The Mutants.
A classic X-Men podcast. Produced and hosted by MaGnUs. Intro music by Loyalty Freak. Original cover art by Pablo Praino after Jack Kirby. Logo by MaGnUs after Brodsky and Artie Simek.
Welcome, children of the atom, to episode 0 of The Mutants, a podcast where I'll read each issue of the Stan Lee Jack Kirby X-Men run, make a short analysis review, and take a look at what was going on in the turbulent real world of the 1960s at the same time the comic was being published. This is, of course, the original X-Men book, later renamed Uncanny X-Men. We will be reading the first 19 issues of the book, published between September 1963 and April 1966. You probably know who Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are, but who am I? Well, I go by the name of MaGnUs, and I've been a podcaster radio host for over 20 years, and a cultural journalist for a bit more. I mostly talk and write about nerdy stuff like comics, science fiction, and role-playing games, but in the past couple of years, I've also branched out into science communication. I founded, host, and produce Perdidos en el Éter, the longest-running podcast in my country, Uruguay, and the second one to ever exist here. It's also one of the oldest podcasts in Latin America, and in the Spanish language altogether. We started out in 2003 with a brief stint on a commercial FM station as a small segment within a general interest show, then had our own show for a couple of years on a public access community radio station, and very soon we were uploading our episodes to the internet for on-demand listening. This was before YouTube, podcasts, Spotify, or anything like that were popular. In fact, the word podcast had only been coined in 2004. However, that's a whole another podcast, which you can check out if you understand Spanish and you're interested in stuff other than the X-Men. But why the X-Men? Why am I making this podcast now? Well, I could say it's because it's 2023 and the X-Men turned 60 this year. But I'm releasing this first episode when the year is almost over. In fact, I am recording this at 2:14 a.m. on December 31st. I've been planning on making this podcast for over 2 years now, but I suffer from clinical depression, and that makes it hard for me to actually act on my plans. Call it executive dysfunction. Sounds like a mutant crossover. I've done many things to spur me into actually making this show. I have announced it in my social networks, on my other podcasts. I made preliminary research and laid out the possible episode structure, wrote notes for this first script, and even commissioned original art for the show. And now, the last 2 weeks of December have come, and I decided I had to stop lollygagging and just write the script, record the episode, and release it once and for all. I will try to release an episode a month, but it might end up being once every other month sometimes. Bottom line, I really want to make this podcast, and it was time I took the plunge. Back to the X-Men. Why is this podcast about the X-Men? Well, that one's easy. They're my favorite superhero comic of all time, my favorite superhero team. I recently had an episode on the X-Men on my other podcast, and I realized that while I don't espouse that stupid Marvel vs. DC fandom mentality, and I'm a big fan of both companies, I am a fan of a lot of different DC properties like Superman, Green Lantern, The Legend of Superheroes, The Question, etc. But the only Marvel thing I'm really a fan of are the X-Men. But it's such a big sub-franchise, I can safely say I'm equal parts of Marvel and DC fan. I've been reading the X-Men since I was at least 5, from the collection of one of my older brothers, Daniel, around 17 years my senior, who later gave me all of his superhero comic books. One book in particular is a Marvel's Greatest Superhero Battle softcover mass market edition. It just says, by Stan Lee, and has a big photo of Stan on the back cover and an intro by him, The Works. Published in 1978 by a division of Simon & Schuster, it has the first whole thing battle from Fantastic Four, a fight between Daredevil and the Submariner, Iron Man versus that same underwater guy, Spider-Man versus the Kingpin, Doctor Strange versus Dormammu, etc. But it also has Beware of the Blob from X-Men 3, which, at first glance, sounds like an odd story to include instead of one with Magneto, their arch enemy. But in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense to use this one because it shows off perfectly what a mutant is, how Xavier's school and the team operate, etc. It was the first X-Men story I remember reading, and I was hooked with those elaborate Stan Lee dialogues and awesome Jack Kirby action pages. I also remember reading a Spider-Man giant-sized comic with a reprint of the X-Men guest starring in Amazing, during the time in which the X-Men book ran only reprints and the team made guest appearances in other books dressed in civilian clothes. Then there's an elusive story I remember reading in my brother's comics, but which I've never been able to identify. My brother had a huge comic collection when we lived in the USA, but he sold most of it when we moved to Uruguay and only kept about a dozen tabloid books with Superman, Batman, Captain America, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and the Superman Spidey crossover. Of course, he also had that Greatest Superhero Battles book, but no single issues, and certainly nothing with the X-Men on the cover, not even that book with the Blob story on it. But I distinctly remember reading a story with Thunderbird, John Proudstar, who, as you might know, died in his second story, X-Men 94 and 95. My brother didn't own these issues, and I remember Thunderbird in a yellow and blue X-Men costume, which he never wore. My theory is that years later I read my first New Mutant story, I love the New Mutants, saw Danny Moonstar, another Native American character, and my mind conflated both characters. Not only is that a bit racist on my part, it is also very weird, because after that battle book, the other X-Men comics I had access to were 80s stuff in Spanish reprints, both of Uncanny X-Men and New Mutants. There was the early 90s for me with no Thunderbird in sight, not even his brother. I don't remember where I first learned that Thunderbird had been a part of the X-Men and died, because there was no internet, no books about comics that I had access to, nothing. I wouldn't read Giant Size X-Men 1 until much later. The mind works in mysterious ways. And there you have it. That battle with the Blob plus that appearance in a Spidey book sparked something in me. And then, those Claremont books I got in Spanish translations hooked me, and I was a fan for life. Of course, the Kirby component had entered my mind with the Fantastic Four stuff I read, so it was a given. By the way, in Spain, where the reprints I read were published, they call the X-Men La Patrulla X, the X-Patrol. What do I like about the X-Men? Well, of course I'm attracted to the social justice aspect of it, because that was already part of the 80s books when I became a fan, even though it's not that present in the Lee Kirby stuff. Stan claimed at different points in history that he did create the X-Men as a social racial allegory, or that he absolutely did not. You know how he could be, and we will look into that when we're going over the actual comics. Still, one of the elements of mutant comics that I find so fascinating is that, besides fighting to save the world and protect people, they're fighting for their own survival. At the same time, they're trying to protect those who hate and fear them, to quote a well-used phrase. That separates them from the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the Justice League. I am a child of political exiles, and my father was a lawyer and professor who specialized in human rights and constitutional law. So, fighting against oppression and for your rights is something that is bound to be interesting to me. Another factor that makes the X-Men so attractive to me is the family aspect. Yes, the Fantastic Four are a family, but most other super teams aren't. They're jobs or friend groups at best. The X-Men feel like a family. I guess living in the school together will do that. Then there's the diversity. Not only the ethnic, cultural diversity and the many strong female characters, but also the variety of distinct power sets and very original powers in many cases. I've identified that as an aspect that draws me to my other favorite super team, the Legion of Superheroes. A lot of members with very specific and sometimes quite narrow power sets, working as a team and interacting like a family. Yes, the ethnic and cultural diversity helps a lot, even though the original X-Men are 5 white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from the US. The 80s X-Men, the ones I became a fan of originally, include a half Kenyan storm goddess, a Russian man made of steel, and my personal favorite, a German swashbuckler who looks unlike anything I had seen in a superhero team before. You guessed it, Nightcrawler is my favorite X-Men, followed, of course, by Magneto. Then there's the New Mutants, who among other diverse characters included a South American member, the first South American superhero I ever saw. It didn't matter if Bob McLeod had never seen a football, soccer, goalpost, and didn't know what side to draw it. It didn't matter that actually, my favorite New Mutants are Cannonball and Warlock. Roberto Bobby Berto da Costa, Sunspot, was from Brazil, a lot closer to my home than Westchester County. The New Mutants even visit Rio de Janeiro, a place I had been to when I was 2 years old and I remember nothing but still. Seriously, Sunspot being South American is just a tiny detail, but I love the overall diversity of the X-Men world. A diversity we won't really see in the 19 issues of X-Men we will be covering in this podcast, but well. Speaking of this 19-issue run, for brevity's sake we'll call it the Lee Kirby run, but the truth is that unlike Fantastic Four where they did over 100 issues together, Kirby actually left the book after issue 17. Not only that, but he stopped doing full pencils after issue 11, not even a full year. Issues 12 through 17, Kirby provides layouts with one instead of Alex Toth pencils and the rest drawn by Werner Roth under the name J. Gavin. Roth will take on full penciling duties from issue 18 until issue 29, then a couple of issues in the 30s, and finish his X-Men work with a pretty long stint, issues 38 to 57, longer than Kirby himself was on the book. Kirby provides cover pencils up to and included issue 17, and the cover to issue 18 is probably finished by Roth from a Kirby sketch according to some reports. Roth takes over covers from issue 19, although Jack comes back for one cover on issue 25. Stan Lee remains the unifying presence during those 18 issues, after which the book is turned over to his protege Roy Thomas. However, starting with issue 20, there is now an editing credit for Lee, which I guess he was also doing before. In his flamboyant crediting style with stuff such as skillfully scripted by Roy Thomas and perfectly penciled by J. Gavin, he modestly gives himself an expertly edited by accolade. But was he involved in plotting? All signs point to no, as Lee was very busy with actually running the whole Marvel line, and Thomas's run on the book veers in a completely different direction, basically ignoring the mutant angle of the story and pitting the X-Men against second-tier villains from other books. Speaking of credits, I will try to do some research on how exactly Lee and Kirby worked on this run and how much of the Marvel method was in use. For those of you who don't know, the Marvel method was a way of making comics instituted by Stan Lee while he was writing and editing all of the Marvel books during the early 60s. Basically, he would write a paragraph detailing the plot of, say, a Hulk issue and give that to the artist. The artist would then take that home and draw some 20 pages of story, breaking down Lee's plot summary into pages and panels. Then, with the comic pages in hand, Stan would write the dialogue, building upon what the artist had drawn. This means that while not credited as such, the artists were co-plotters, as the actual whole story before the dialogue would be a collaboration between Lee and whoever was drawing it. Yes, by adding the right dialogue and narration, Stan could shape the story in whichever way he wanted, but the framework was provided by the artist. Jack Kirby had been a writer-artist for almost 30 years by 1963, so when working with Stan, he wrote dialogue and story elements on the margin of his art pages, expanding on Lee's plot and the art he himself had drawn. Both authors even held actual plotting sessions, meeting in Stan's office to hash out stories before Jack went off to draw them. However, these sessions seem to usually have been for Fantastic Four. I've also read interviews where Kirby says that there were only a couple of these meetings, mostly for show. He said that most of the plotting was done separately, as described before, with perhaps a phone call here and there to iron out some details. Stan Lee was even famous for ignoring plot and dialogue elements in the art pages, and without a detailed retelling by him and Kirby of who thought of what story element, it would be impossible to know what happened. Lee was famous for taking credit for other people's ideas, even if he did have a lot of great ones, and Kirby wasn't too keen on talking about these things. Another element of this podcast will be a brief look at what was going on in the real world the month or months around each issue's publication. It is impossible to know exactly when each issue was written, but let's say we look at what happened the month immediately before each issue was released, maybe a few months or a year before for issue 1. I'll do a general overview of major world events and also look at my own country, Uruguay, which was undergoing a very turbulent period. Well, not unlike the whole region and world. 1963 is only 10 years before a CIA-backed military coup in Uruguay. I am not a historian, not even a political journalist, and I am a left-wing voter, so be warned, I will sound like a pinko commie bastard at times, or all the time. Speaking of how I sound, I was born in the US because my family lived there due to my father's status as a political exile. Uruguay was ruled by a military dictatorship between 1973 and 1985. At home, I spoke both Spanish and English, and I am a native speaker of both languages. However, from age 5, I'm almost 44 now, most of my daily spoken communication has been in Spanish. That changed a little bit in my mid-20s when I started working from English-speaking companies, and I speak both languages with my kid who just turned 19. Why am I telling you this? Well, because even though I'm confident in my English skills, and I've given public talks in English and held meetings in language and all that, I have never podcasted in English before. I have talked at length about comics on the internet by text. This means that many of the character names I'll be saying in this podcast I've almost never used in an English conversation before. Sure, I don't normally use the Spanish code name for most characters, but it's one thing to say an English name or word in the midst of a conversation in Spanish with the right pronunciation, and a completely different thing to say that name using the full English tone and inflection. Yes, there is a tone for each language. Maybe it's just me, I know it's not just me, but I find it very pretentious when someone's talking in Spanish and, all of a sudden, puts on their thickest English speaker inflection to pronounce the name of a place or band. Sí, estuvo buenísimo. Fuimos con mi hermano a New York y vimos a The Cure en vivo. There is a difference between that and sí, estuvo buenísimo. Fuimos con mi hermano a New York y vimos a The Cure en vivo. You can tell I pronounced the English names pretty much correctly, yet I didn't stray from the general inflection of my Spanish accent. As for the X-Men, Cyclops, Angel, and Beast can be Cíclope, Ángel, and Bestia because they're straightforward translations and sound almost the same. But then, there are name translations that are so absolutely different and outright awful that I dislike them completely. And that's a whole nother can of worms. There are names I will struggle to say in proper English because I've never gotten into the habit of doing so. Namor shows up in issue 6 of the X-Men, but all of my life I call him Namor, so forgive me if I slip when it comes to El Niño Sin Amor. Blech. And even though I know Jack Kirby's name is pronounced Kirby, I've said Kirby all my life, and I will slip. I might correct myself and edit as I am editing this whole podcast now. And then there's Xavier and Magneto. I will not call them Xavier and Magneto. Xavier is just plain wrong, and Magneto, well, even Stan Lee couldn't make up his mind about this. I will admit that, while he is the mutant master of magnetism, the word Magneto existed before the character. It's a type of magnet using electrical generator, and it's actually pronounced that way. It's not the word magnet with an O added at the end. I will still call them Magneto because this is my podcast. Also, I usually podcast with other people, not just me on the microphone, so I hope you won't get bored of my voice and bear with me as I find my stride as a narrator. Why is this podcast called The Mutants? Well, first of all, that is the name Stan Lee said he wanted to use for the X-Men, but his boss, publisher Martin Goodman, nixed it, saying nobody knows what a mutant is. Me, I would have liked it that way because for the past few years, I've grown a bit dissatisfied with the word men being part of the book and team names when this is one of the superhero comics in the world best known for its relevant female characters. I know that there aren't many good alternatives. X-People is clunky, X-Patrol sounds too militarily, and the Doom Patrol might have something to say. I mean, the Mutants is still there. Uncanny was my first option for the podcast name, but it's both in use by a BBC podcast about UFOs, ghosts, and all manner of unexplained phenomena, and a Spanish language podcast from Peru about everything that only released 2 episodes. Okay. Not only that, but the term uncanny wasn't used in relation to the X-Men until 1974, in a banner on the first page of Giant Size X-Men #1, reading Stan Lee presents The Uncanny X-Men. It didn't show up on the cover of the book until 1978's issues 114. Even then, it was only Uncanny X-Men on the cover until 1980's issue 142, when it also became the actual publication's name, the one in the legal indicia text inside of the book. Other options also taken by podcasts or websites were Cerebro, Children of the Atom, Danger Room, Grey Malkin Lane, Gifted Youngster, and School for Gifted Youngsters. The last 3 choices I narrowed it down to, thanks to my friend Ese and Cal for the input, were To Me My Mutants, The Mutants, and the strangest podcast of them all. The Mutants ended up winning because it's short and sweet, plus it harkens back to the original name for the book. This has been all for episode 0. I hope you weren't too bored by it. I want to thank my friends Ezequiel and Cal, my wife Cynthia, and my kid, known as Profesor Dinosaurio, as well as Ian and Goose, 2 friends of mine who've been doing very entertaining podcasts rereading classic DC comics, starting with Crisis on Infinite Earths, and now they're covering the Bwahaha Justice League era. I'd also like to thank my friend Pablo Praino for the awesome cover art he drew for the podcast, channeling his inner Jack Kirby. I hope that you will join me for the next episode, where we will cover X-Men number 1, the strangest superheroes of all. Until next issue, to me, my mutants. Studio Robota.
Transmission for a string.